You have no right to grab me like this.
Madam, calm down. You are under arrest for theft. Please cooperate.
I said I didn't take anything. Let go of me.
Hey, let's slow this down. Ma'am, listen to him. Antoine, easy. You can't.
She's going down.
Get her legs. I've got her. Dispatch, medic to...
March 15th, 2024. Deputy Director Victoria Hayes had been the FBI's most trusted black executive for 12 years. The woman they called Unbreakable. That's exactly why she never saw Agent Martinez coming. Victoria was jogging her usual route through DuPont Circle when the ICE van pulled up. 4 agents, rough hands, shouted commands in Spanish she pretended not to understand. What happened in the next 8 minutes became the most investigated incident in federal law enforcement history. The Justice Department held emergency hearings because of it. And for months afterward, when people talked about racial profiling in federal agencies, they always came back to this morning. The morning Victoria Hayes had a heart attack. The morning she discovered that sometimes the dead don't stay buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first mistake was running without her badge. Victoria's chest burned as Agent Rodriguez, his nameplate gleamed in the morning sun, pressed her face against the ICE van's hood. The metal was cold against her cheek, but not as cold as the recognition flooding her system when she glimpsed the team leader standing 3 feet away, Martinez. 15 years older, broader shoulders, but those same dark eyes that used to seek her approval across bureau briefing rooms. The rookie she'd molded, guided, protected, until that night in 2009 when everything went sideways. "Ma'am, we need you to calm down," Rodriguez said, his knee digging into her spine. "Immigration status verification, routine procedure." Routine. Victoria almost laughed if she could breathe properly. Nothing about this was routine. Not Martinez leading an ICE unit when he'd been FBI. Not the fact that he hadn't looked directly at her once since the takedown began. And definitely not the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. Too fast. Too irregular. She gasped, trying to turn her head toward Martinez. "Federal agent, FBI, Deputy Director Victoria Hayes." "Right," Rodriguez snorted. "And I'm the Pope." "Lady, you think we haven't heard every story?" But Martinez had gone very still. She could feel his attention like a weight, even though he kept his back turned, speaking quietly into his radio. Whatever he was saying, she couldn't make it out over the traffic noise from Connecticut Avenue. The chest pain sharpened, radiating down her left arm. Real panic now, not just the situational stress she'd been trained to manage. This was different, wrong. Her vision blurred at the edges. "Martinez," she whispered, but her voice came out strangled. He didn't respond, didn't turn around. But his radio conversation stopped. Victoria's legs gave out. Rodriguez cursed, grabbing her arms to keep her upright, but the movement sent lightning through her chest. The morning joggers, the coffee shop patrons, the dog walkers, everyone was stopping to stare. Phones coming out, recording. "She's having some kind of episode," Rodriguez called out. "Medical," Martinez said sharply into his radio, finally turning toward them. His face was carefully blank, professional. But when their eyes met for just a second, she saw something flicker there, recognition. And something else, fear? The world tilted. Victoria's knees hit the pavement hard, Rodriguez trying to support her weight. The cardiac pain was overwhelming now, crushing. She'd survived 2 decades in federal law enforcement, navigated the Bureau's boys' club as the only black woman who'd made it to the 7th floor, built a reputation on never showing weakness. She was going to die on a sidewalk because some ICE agents thought she looked like someone who didn't belong in her own neighborhood. "Ambulance is 3 minutes out," someone shouted. Martinez was beside her now, finally, his hand on her shoulder, steadying her as she slumped against the van. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his hair. The wedding ring that hadn't been there 15 years ago. "Just breathe," he said quietly. "Help's coming." Victoria tried to focus on his voice, but the pain was eating everything. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. Through the growing darkness, she saw Martinez's hand move to his jacket pocket. Quick, practiced. When it emerged, something small pressed against her palm. A folded piece of paper. "The witness had a daughter," Martinez whispered, so low only she could hear. "She's all grown up now, federal prosecutor, Southern District of New York. And Victoria?" His grip tightened on her hand. "She knows what really happened to her mother." The world went black. When the paramedics arrived 90 seconds later, they found Deputy Director Victoria Hayes unconscious on the sidewalk outside Kramer Books. surrounded by ICE agents who insisted they'd been conducting a routine immigration check. The video footage would show Martinez stepping back as the medical team took over, his face professionally concerned. What the footage wouldn't show was the piece of paper now clutched in Victoria's unconscious fist, or the way Martinez watched the ambulance disappear down Connecticut Avenue before getting on his phone to make a call that would set everything in motion. In George Washington University Hospital's cardiac unit, Victoria's heart rate stabilized within the hour. The attending physician would note unusual stress markers in her blood work, but attribute them to the traumatic arrest. He'd recommend a few days of rest and observation. He wouldn't know that Victoria Hayes hadn't really had a heart attack. She'd had a resurrection, because 15 years after she thought she'd buried the past deep enough, Agent Sophia Martinez had just handed her proof that some secrets have a way of growing in the dark. And some daughters never stop looking for their mother's killers. The dead don't stay buried, not when they leave children behind. If you're following along with this story, drop a comment below telling me what you think Victoria will find on that piece of paper. I read every single one, and tomorrow's chapter might just surprise you. Hit that follow button, because this is just the beginning. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor was Victoria's first companion back to consciousness. Her eyes opened to institutional white ceiling tiles, white walls, white sheets that smelled of bleach and other people's fears. The ICU at George Washington University Hospital looked exactly like every other ICU she'd visited over the years to interview witnesses, victims, and perpetrators who'd found themselves broken enough to need saving. She'd never expected to be the one in the bed. The paper was still there, a small miracle pressed against her palm beneath the thin hospital blanket. Her fingers traced its edges while she oriented herself. 4 in her left arm, heart monitor leads snaking across her chest, the peculiar vulnerability of a hospital gown that never quite closed properly. Through the window, late afternoon light painted the room golden. She'd lost most of the day. Victoria had built her career on compartmentalization, but lying here, she couldn't stop her mind from drifting to the apartment waiting for her 12 blocks away. Plants that needed watering, a cat named Morrison who'd be pacing by his empty food bowl, probably knocking books off her nightstand in protest. Sunday dinner plans with her sister Carmen and the twins, 7-year-old chaos that had become the brightest part of her weeks. Such ordinary concerns for a woman whose past was apparently climbing out of its grave. The photo on her nightstand at home showed 4 generations of Hayes women. Great-grandmother Evelyn, who'd cleaned houses in Georgetown while saving every penny for her daughter's education. Grandmother Ruth, the first in their family to finish high school. Mother Grace, who'd worked 2 jobs to put Victoria through college and had lived just long enough to see her graduate from Quantico. 3 women who'd sacrificed so their daughters could climb higher. Victoria had climbed the highest of all. Deputy Director of the FBI at 54, the only black woman in the Bureau's senior leadership. She'd survived 22 years in an institution that had barely tolerated her presence, much less her authority. She'd made herself indispensable by being twice as prepared, 3 times as careful, and absolutely invisible when it mattered most. Invisible. That word carried weight she'd spent decades trying to forget. The door opened, and Dr. Patel entered with a chart and the weary efficiency of someone who'd been delivering medical verdicts all day. Director Hayes, how are you feeling? Like I've been hit by a truck. Victoria kept her voice steady, professional. When can I leave? Let's talk about that. He pulled up the visitor's chair, and Victoria's chest tightened. Doctors who sat down had more complicated conversations. Your stress markers were unusual for a typical cardiac event. Has anything been causing particular anxiety lately? Work pressure? Personal issues? Everything, Victoria thought. Aloud, she said, nothing out of the ordinary. Dr. Patel made a note. The good news is, there's no permanent damage to your heart muscle, but I'd like to keep you for observation tonight. Sometimes, these events can be warnings. His pen tapped against the chart. You mentioned your FBI during intake. High-stress profession. When's the last time you took real time off? Real time off. As if she could explain that relaxation was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. That every vacation, every quiet evening, every moment of letting her guard down carried the risk of someone discovering that Deputy Director Victoria Hayes wasn't quite as clean as her record suggested. I'll consider it, she lied. After Dr. Patel left, Victoria finally allowed herself to unfold Martinez's note. The paper was cheap, torn from a small notebook, the kind patrol officers carried. The handwriting was still his. Precise block letters she remembered from evidence logs and case reports when he'd been eager to prove himself worthy of her mentorship. Isabella Reyes, SDNY. She doesn't know you yet, but she knows enough. The Rivera case files weren't destroyed. She has them. And Victoria, she looks just like her mother. The paper trembled in Victoria's hands. Elena Rivera, the federal witness who'd been prepared to testify about corruption in the U.S. Attorney's Office until someone decided her testimony was too dangerous. Someone who'd made a phone call that sent killers to a safe house in Arlington. Someone who'd looked the other way while a young mother was silenced forever, leaving behind a 3-year-old daughter who apparently hadn't forgotten. Victoria closed her eyes, remembering Elena's file photo. Dark hair, intelligent eyes, the determined set of her jaw that came from growing up poor and clawing your way towards something better. She looked like Victoria's own mother in some ways. That same fierce protectiveness when she talked about her daughter, the same willingness to risk everything for the chance at justice, the same trust in the FBI that had gotten her killed. Outside her hospital window, Washington, D.C. hummed with its eternal purpose, the machinery of government grinding forward, indifferent to individual lives caught in its gears. Victoria had spent her career serving that machine, feeding it her conscience piece by piece until she'd convinced herself the sacrifices were worth it. But machines didn't forgive, and apparently neither did the daughters of murdered witnesses. The beeping of her heart monitor quickened as reality crystallized. Martinez hadn't staged this encounter for old time's sake. This was a warning. Isabella Reyes was coming. And when she did, everything Victoria had built, her career, her reputation, her family's security, would be reduced to ashes. Some resurrections, Victoria realized, were just another kind of burial. Victoria stared at Martinez's note until the words blurred together, but she couldn't escape their meaning. Isabella Reyes, the daughter who'd grown up motherless because Victoria had made a phone call that signed Elena Rivera's death warrant. The 3-year-old who'd become a federal prosecutor with access to case files that should have been destroyed 15 years ago. The cardiac monitor's beeping accelerated with her pulse. Victoria forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not here, not with nurses who might sedate her, keeping her trapped while Isabella Reyes built her case. The hospital room door opened again, but this time it wasn't Dr. Patel. The woman who entered wore a charcoal suit that Victoria recognized as expensive even before she noted the confident stride, the way she carried herself like someone accustomed to courtrooms and power. Mid-30s, Latina, with Elena Rivera's dark hair and intelligent eyes. The same determined jawline Victoria remembered from a dead woman's photographs. Deputy Director Hayes. The voice was professionally courteous, but Victoria caught the steel underneath. I'm Isabella Reyes, Assistant United States Attorney, Southern District of New York. There it was. The past walking through her hospital room door, wearing a prosecutor's badge and carrying what looked like a legal portfolio. Victoria's chest tightened again, but this time it had nothing to do with cardiac stress. Ms. Reyes. Victoria kept her voice level, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. This is unexpected. I imagine it is. Isabella moved to the visitor's chair but didn't sit. Instead, she placed her portfolio on the bedside table with deliberate care. I was in Washington for depositions when I heard about your incident this morning. Quite a coincidence. Coincidence. Victoria had stopped believing in those the moment Martinez slipped her that note. You have me at a disadvantage. Should I know why you're here? Isabella's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I think you know exactly why I'm here, but let me clarify anyway. She opened the portfolio and withdrew a photograph, old, slightly faded, showing a young woman with a toddler on her hip. Do you recognize her? Elena Rivera smiled up from the photograph, her arm wrapped protectively around a little girl with serious dark eyes, the same eyes that now studied Victoria with prosecutorial intensity. Should I? Victoria asked, but the words felt like ash in her mouth. Her name was Elena Rivera. She was a federal witness under Bureau protection in 2009. She was also my mother. Isabella's voice never wavered, but Victoria caught the slight tightening around her eyes. She was murdered 3 days before she was scheduled to testify in a corruption case that would have brought down half the U.S. Attorney's office. The room felt smaller suddenly, the white walls pressing inward. Victoria had prepared for this conversation for 15 years, rehearsed denials and deflections and plausible doubt. But lying to a daughter whose mother you'd helped kill required a different kind of coldness than she'd expected. "I'm sorry for your loss," Victoria managed, "but I'm not sure why you're telling me this." Isabella reached into the portfolio again, this time withdrawing a thick file folder. "Because yesterday, I received these, copies of the original case files, including FBI communications that were supposedly destroyed years ago." She opened the folder and placed a document on Victoria's lap. "This one's particularly interesting." Victoria's breath caught. It was a bureau communication log, showing phone calls made from her office extension on the night Elena Rivera died. The timestamp was unmistakable. 6:47 p.m., 3 hours before the safe house was compromised. The receiving number belonged to Thomas Kellerman, the assistant U.S. attorney who'd been leading the corruption ring Elena was set to expose. "That's your extension number, isn't it?" Isabella's tone was conversational, almost friendly. Amazing how these old records surface sometimes. Digital forensics have come so far since 2009. Victoria stared at the evidence of her betrayal, reduced to numbers on a page. She'd made that call thinking she was protecting the Bureau from a scandal that would have destroyed public trust. Elena Rivera was going to testify that FBI agents had taken bribes to look the other way on trafficking cases, that the corruption went all the way up to the assistant director level. Victoria had convinced herself that one witness's death was a reasonable price to preserve the institution. She'd been 29 years old and terrified of losing everything she'd worked for. "You can't prove intent from a phone log," Victoria said quietly. "No," Isabella agreed, "but I can prove pattern. Because Elena Rivera wasn't the only witness who died before testifying about FBI corruption, was she? There were 3 others over 18 months, all under your protection, all dead within days of their scheduled testimony." The cardiac monitor's beeping filled the silence between them. Victoria realized that Martinez hadn't just warned her about Isabella Reyes. He'd been telling her that the reckoning she'd spent 15 years avoiding had finally arrived, and it was wearing her victim's face. Victoria's hands moved instinctively to smooth the hospital blanket, a nervous gesture she'd trained out of herself decades ago. The phone log stared up at her like an accusation, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "These allegations are serious, Ms. Reyes. I assume you've shared this information with the appropriate authorities." Isabella's laugh was soft, almost musical. "Oh, I haven't shared this with anyone yet. That's what makes this conversation so interesting." She pulled the visitor's chair closer to the bed, finally sitting. "See, I've spent the last 3 years building this case in my spare time, tracking down witnesses, following paper trails, reconstructing what happened to my mother. And you know what I discovered?" Victoria waited, her chest tight with more than cardiac stress. "Everyone's afraid of you." Isabella leaned back, studying Victoria like a specimen. "Former agents who won't return calls when your name comes up. Prosecutors who suddenly develop amnesia about cases from 2009. Even my own supervisor gets nervous when I mention investigating FBI corruption from that era. It's fascinating, really, the power you wield just by existing." The words hit Victoria like ice water. She'd cultivated that fear carefully over the years, wielding her reputation and connections like armor. In the Bureau, being feared was safer than being respected. Fear kept people from asking inconvenient questions. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Isabella withdrew another document from her portfolio. Agent Martinez, for instance. "He used to work under you, didn't he? Before he transferred to ICE in 2009, right around the time my mother was killed." Victoria's blood turned to ice. Martinez's terrified face flashed through her memory. The rookie agent who'd discovered irregularities in the witness protection program, who'd started asking questions about why so many witnesses died before testifying. She'd had him transferred before he could dig deeper. Told herself she was protecting him from dangerous knowledge. "Agent Martinez made quite an impression on you, it seems," Isabella continued, her tone deceptively casual. "Enough that you personally arranged his transfer. Very unusual for someone at your level to take such interest in a junior agent's career path. Personnel decisions are made for many reasons, including silencing inconvenient investigators." Isabella's voice sharpened. "Because that's what Martinez was becoming, wasn't he? An inconvenience, just like my mother." The cardiac monitor betrayed Victoria's rising panic, its rhythm quickening audibly. She needed to end this conversation, needed time to think, to plan. But Isabella wasn't finished. "I've been watching you for months, Deputy Director, studying your patterns, your associations, your vulnerabilities." Isabella's eyes glittered with something that looked like satisfaction. "Did you know you jog the same route every Sunday? Always alone, always predictable. It makes you accessible." The implication hit Victoria like a physical blow. "You orchestrated this morning." "I prefer to think of it as creating an opportunity for dialogue." Isabella stood, smoothing her suit jacket. Martinez was surprisingly cooperative once I explained what I knew about his role in covering up federal witness murders. Amazing how quickly people find their conscience when faced with conspiracy charges. Victoria's mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of what Isabella was revealing. Martinez hadn't warned her out of loyalty or guilt. He'd been compromised, turned into Isabella's weapon. The staged heart attack, the note, even this conversation, all carefully choreographed to corner her when she was most vulnerable. "What do you want?" Victoria's voice cracked slightly. Isabella tilted her head, considering. "Justice for my mother. But more than that, I want to understand you. What kind of person sacrifices innocent people to protect an institution? What kind of woman climbs over the bodies of other women to reach the top? You don't understand the position I was in." "I understand perfectly." Isabella's voice turned cold. "You were a young agent desperate to succeed in a white man's world. You convinced yourself that protecting the Bureau's reputation was more important than protecting the witnesses you'd sworn to defend. You made a calculation, their lives against your career." Each word landed like a scalpel, precise and devastating. Victoria felt exposed, stripped of the careful layers of justification she'd built around her choices. In Isabella's eyes, she saw not just accusation but something worse, disappointment, as if she'd expected better from another woman of color who'd fought to succeed in federal law enforcement. "The question now," Isabella continued, placing the photographs and documents back in her portfolio, "is what you're prepared to do about it. Because tomorrow morning, I'm filing a motion to reopen the Elena Rivera case. I have enough evidence to start an investigation, but not enough to guarantee convictions." She paused at the hospital room door, her hand on the handle. "But I will, because unlike you, Deputy Director, I don't sacrifice justice for convenience, and I don't abandon the people depending on me to survive." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Victoria alone with the beeping monitor and the crushing weight of her past finally catching up. Victoria stared at the closed door for 30 seconds before reaching for her phone. Her hands shook, not from the cardiac episode, but from the seismic shift she felt beneath everything she'd built. 22 years of careful construction, and it was all crumbling because a 3-year-old had grown up with questions. The first call went to her chief of staff. "Cancel everything for the next 40 to 8 hours, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Medical leave. Deputy Director, should I?" No statements, no visitors. "And Sarah? If anyone asks about the Elena Rivera case, you've never heard of it." The silence on the other end stretched too long. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Victoria closed her eyes. Even her own staff would abandon her once the truth surfaced. "Just follow my instructions." After disconnecting, she pulled up her contacts and scrolled to a number she hadn't called in years. It rang 4 times before a gravelly voice answered. Well, Victoria Hayes. Thought you'd forgotten about us little people." Thomas. The name felt like poison on her tongue. Thomas Kellerman, the former assistant U.S. attorney who'd received that damning phone call 15 years ago. The man who'd orchestrated Elena Rivera's murder and walked away with a quiet resignation and a lucrative private practice. "We need to talk, do we? Because last I heard, you'd become untouchable. Deputy Director of the FBI, making 7 figures, probably have your eye on the director's chair. Why would you want to associate with a washed-up lawyer like me? Because you're the only one who knows how deep this goes," Victoria thought. Aloud she said, "Elena Rivera's daughter is a federal prosecutor. She has files." The silence that followed was different, charged with the same terror Victoria felt clawing at her chest. "That's impossible," Kellerman said finally. "Everything was destroyed. You assured me." "I was wrong." The admission tasted like bile. "She has communication logs, timestamps, everything. And she's turning Martinez into a cooperative witness." Jesus Christ. Victoria heard rustling, probably Kellerman pouring himself a drink. It wasn't even noon. How much does she know? Enough to destroy us both. And she's not interested in deals or compromises. She wants justice. Justice. Kellerman's laugh was bitter. 15 years too late for that, don't you think? Elena Rivera is still dead. Those trafficking victims are still dead. Justice is a luxury for people who don't understand how the world actually works. Victoria closed her eyes, remembering the morning she'd made that phone call. Elena Rivera had been scheduled to testify about a trafficking network that had purchased FBI agents like groceries, turning the Bureau into an accessory to modern slavery. The evidence would have implicated 12 agents, 3 supervisors, and reached all the way to the assistant director level. It would have destroyed public trust in federal law enforcement for a generation. But it would also have saved lives, hundreds of women and children who continued to disappear because the network remained operational. Victoria had told herself she was preventing a larger catastrophe, but sitting in this hospital bed, she finally understood what Isabella saw when she looked at her, a woman who'd chosen institutional survival over human lives. "There's something else," Victoria said quietly. Isabella Reyes isn't just seeking justice for her mother. She's been building this case for 3 years. She knows about the others, the witnesses who died, the patterns, everything. This isn't just about Elena anymore. The line went quiet except for Kellerman's labored breathing. Victoria could practically hear him calculating, trying to find an escape route that didn't exist. "We could discredit her," he said eventually. "Emotional prosecutor seeking revenge, willing to fabricate evidence, character assassination. It's worked before. She's untouchable." Victoria had done her research during Isabella's brief absence from the room. Harvard Law Review, spotless conviction record, commendations from 3 attorney generals. She's everything the Justice Department wants in a prosecutor. Going after her would only validate her claims. Then what do you suggest? Because I'm not spending my retirement in federal prison because you couldn't keep your ghost buried. Victoria stared at the phone log Isabella had left behind, evidence of the moment she'd chosen survival over conscience. But there was something else in the file, something she'd noticed during Isabella's presentation. Financial records showing payments to the trafficking network continued for months after Elena's death, signed off by agents whose names she recognized. The corruption hadn't ended with Elena's murder, it had simply adapted, which meant there were more victims, more families destroyed by her silence. "The trafficking network is still operational," Victoria said slowly. "Isabella doesn't just have evidence of what we did 15 years ago. She has evidence of what we're still allowing to happen." Kellerman's breathing stopped altogether, because they both understood what that meant. This wasn't just about prosecuting past crimes. Isabella Reyes had the evidence to prove that Victoria's betrayal was ongoing, that her silence had enabled 15 years of additional murders. The hospital room suddenly felt like a confessional, and Victoria realized that some sins were too large for absolution. The silence stretched between Victoria and Kellerman until she could hear her own pulse in her ears. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a desperation she'd never heard before. "We destroy her credibility before she files that motion. I still have contacts in justice, people who owe me favors." "No." Victoria's voice cut through his panic like a blade. "There's something you need to know first, something I never told you." She could hear Kellerman's breathing quicken, matching the rhythm of her cardiac monitor. Elena Rivera wasn't just a witness, Thomas. She was an informant. My informant. The words felt like glass in her throat. I recruited her personally. Spent 6 months building trust with her, convincing her that cooperating was the only way to protect her daughter. She trusted me completely. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Victoria had carried this secret for 15 years, the weight of personal betrayal layered beneath institutional corruption. Elena hadn't just been a witness who died under FBI protection. She'd been a woman who'd risked everything because Victoria Hayes had looked her in the eye and promised her safety. "You never mentioned..." "Because it wasn't relevant to your part." Victoria's voice hardened. "You just needed the location of the safe house. You didn't need to know that Elena called me Hermana, or that she'd shown me pictures of Isabella's first day of kindergarten, or that she'd asked me to be her daughter's godmother if anything happened to her." The cardiac monitor betrayed the emotional storm raging through Victoria's chest. She could see Elena's face so clearly now, the hope in her eyes when Victoria had promised that testifying would give Isabella a future free from the violence that had consumed their community. Jesus, Victoria, If that comes out, it already has. Victoria's voice cracked. Isabella knows. She has recordings. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Kellerman's sharp intake of breath was audible across the connection. What recordings? Phone calls between Elena and me. Personal conversations where I assured her she was safe, where I promised to protect her and Isabella no matter what. Victoria closed her eyes, remembering Elena's voice. Soft, grateful, completely trusting. Isabella played them for me, her mother talking about the FBI agent who was going to save their family. Me promising that nothing bad would happen as long as Elena told the truth. That's impossible. Those calls weren't monitored. Elena recorded them herself. Victoria's laugh was hollow. She wanted to have proof of FBI cooperation in case something went wrong. Motherly instinct, protecting evidence for her daughter's future. She hid the recordings with a friend before entering protection. The full scope of Victoria's betrayal was finally taking shape. Not just an institutional failure, but personal treachery of the deepest kind. Isabella hadn't just lost a mother. She'd lost her because the woman she trusted most had sold her out for career advancement. The friend kept the recordings all these years, Victoria continued. Waited until Isabella was old enough and powerful enough to seek justice. Isabella doesn't just have evidence of corruption. She has proof that I personally betrayed a woman who considered me family. Kellerman was quiet for so long that Victoria wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note she'd never heard before, genuine horror. You told me she was just another witness, someone who'd gotten in over her head and needed to be neutralized for the greater good. You never said... He stopped, understanding flooding his tone. You lied to me too. The accusation hit Victoria like a physical slap, because it was true. She'd reduced Elena Rivera to an abstract problem that needed solving, had never told Kellerman about the personal relationship that made the betrayal so much worse. Even in conspiracy, she'd protected herself by compartmentalizing the emotional truth. I told you what you needed to know to do your part, Victoria said. But the justification sounded hollow even to her. My part? Kellerman's voice rose. You made me an accessory to murdering your friend. Do you understand what that makes this? What it makes us? Victoria closed her eyes, finally facing the truth she'd buried for 15 years. She hadn't just chosen institutional survival over witness protection. She'd murdered someone she loved to protect her career. The trafficking network, the corruption, the greater good, all of it had been elaborate justification for the simple fact that she'd valued her position more than Elena's life. It makes us monsters, Victoria whispered. The word hung between them like a verdict, because that's what Isabella saw when she looked at Victoria. Not a complicated woman making impossible choices, but a monster who'd betrayed maternal trust for personal gain. Someone who'd held Elena's daughter in her arms and still made the call that orphaned her. She's not seeking justice, Victoria said finally, understanding flooding through her. She's seeking revenge, and she has every right to it. The phone line went dead, leaving Victoria alone with the truth that some betrayals were too personal for redemption. Victoria sat in the mechanical silence of the hospital room, staring at her phone's blank screen. The truth she'd finally spoken aloud seemed to echo off the sterile walls, growing larger and more damning with each repetition. She'd called herself a monster, and the word fit like a glove she'd been refusing to try on for 15 years. Her fingers moved without conscious thought, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she'd memorized but never saved. Isabella Reyes's direct line at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Victoria had obtained it months ago, part of the background research she conducted on all rising federal prosecutors. She'd told herself it was routine intelligence gathering, but sitting here now, she understood it had been preparation for this inevitable moment. The call connected on the second ring. Ms. Reyes. Isabella's voice carried no surprise, as if she'd been expecting Victoria to reach out. I want to see the recordings. Victoria's voice sounded foreign to her own ears, stripped of the authority she'd spent decades cultivating. The conversations between your mother and me. Why? So you can prepare a defense? So I can remember what I destroyed. The admission escaped before Victoria could stop it. I've spent 15 years convincing myself Elena was just a witness, that our relationship was professional. But that's not true, is it? Isabella was quiet for a moment, and Victoria could hear muffled office sounds in the background, phones ringing, conversations bleeding through walls. the normal rhythm of federal prosecution continuing while Victoria's world collapsed. "She talked about you constantly," Isabella said finally. Agent Victoria, who was different from the others, who spoke Spanish with her, who asked about her family, who promised that cooperating would give me opportunities she never had. Her voice carried a careful neutrality that somehow hurt worse than anger. "She said you reminded her of her own sister, the one who died crossing the border." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She remembered now, Elena's sister Rosa, who drowned in the Rio Grande trying to reach Texas. Elena had shown her a photograph once, two young women who could have been twins except for their expressions. Rosa's face held desperate hope. Elena's carried survivor's guilt that never faded. "She said I had Rosa's eyes," Victoria whispered, the memory flooding back with devastating clarity. "Yes," Isabella's voice softened fractionally. "She said God had sent her a sister to replace the one she lost. Someone who would understand what it meant to build a life from nothing." Victoria closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to remember the woman Elena had been, rather than the problem she'd become. Late-night phone calls when Elena couldn't sleep, terrified about testifying, but more terrified about what would happen to her daughter if she didn't. Victoria bringing Isabella small gifts during safe house visits. Books, art supplies, a stuffed elephant that Isabella had named Esperanza, hope. "I was supposed to be at her funeral," Victoria said, the words escaping like a confession. "She'd made me promise. If anything happened to her, I was supposed to make sure Isabella knew her mother died protecting her future. But you didn't come. I couldn't." Victoria's voice cracked. "Because I knew if I looked at you, if I saw Elena in your face, I wouldn't be able to live with what I'd done." The line went quiet except for Isabella's measured breathing. Victoria could picture her, poised, professional, processing this admission like evidence in a case file. But there was something else in the silence, a human weight that spoke to 15 years of unanswered questions. "She left you a letter," Isabella said eventually. "Wrote it the night before she died. My foster mother gave it to me when I turned 18, along with the recordings and documents Elena had hidden." Victoria's heart stopped. "What did it say?" "That she forgave you in advance for whatever choices you had to make. She said institutional pressure was something women like you and her understood, the impossible mathematics of survival in systems designed to destroy you." Isabella paused. "She said if something happened to her, she hoped you'd remember that she never blamed you for being caught in the same trap she was." The words hit Victoria like a physical assault. Elena's forgiveness felt more devastating than Isabella's accusations, more damning than any evidence in the files, because it revealed the depth of Elena's understanding and the magnitude of Victoria's betrayal of that understanding. "But I chose," Victoria whispered. "When it mattered most, I chose my career over her life." "Yes," Isabella said simply. "You did." The acknowledgement hung between them, final and irrevocable. Victoria understood now why Isabella had orchestrated this confrontation so carefully, not just to expose corruption or secure convictions, but to force Victoria to face the human cost of her choices without the protective barrier of institutional justification. "The motion gets filed tomorrow morning," Isabella continued, her voice returning to prosecutorial efficiency. "After that, everything becomes public record. I thought you should know." The line went dead, leaving Victoria alone with Elena's posthumous forgiveness and the crushing realization that some choices couldn't be undone, no matter how desperately you wanted to take them back. The silence in Victoria's hospital room felt absolute, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Elena's forgiveness echoed in her mind, not the absolution she'd unconsciously craved for 15 years, but something far more devastating, understanding. Even in death, Elena had seen through Victoria's institutional armor to the terrified woman beneath, had recognized the impossible choices that systems of power forced upon those who dared to exist within them. But recognition wasn't exoneration. Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for her laptop, fingers moving with the mechanical precision of someone performing their final official act. The FBI's secure network felt familiar beneath her touch, pathways she'd navigated for 3 decades, digital corridors where she'd built an empire of careful compromises and strategic silence. She pulled up the classified file she'd buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it existed. Not the sanitized version that lived in official records, but the real documentation, the complete timeline of the trafficking network's operations, the full scope of federal complicity, the names of agents still active who continued to profit from Elena's silence. The evidence Isabella needed to destroy not just Victoria, but the entire system that had made Elena's murder profitable. Victoria's finger hovered over the send button. 27 years of career advancement. The first black woman to reach the deputy director level, a position that had cost her everything. Her marriage, her relationship with her children, her ability to sleep without nightmares, and still somehow felt inadequate compensation for Elena's life. She thought of Isabella, alone in her office, preparing to file a motion that would expose decades of corruption but might not reach the full network. Isabella had Elena's recordings and Kellerman's financial trails, but she didn't have the classified operational files that would reveal how deep the rot actually went. Victoria pressed send. The files transferred with electronic efficiency, carrying 30 years of carefully buried evidence directly to Isabella Reyes's secure government email. Bank records, communication logs, operational reports that detailed exactly how federal agents had monetized human trafficking through calculated witness elimination. Everything Isabella would need to dismantle the network that had outlived Elena by 15 years. Her phone rang immediately. Kellerman's number flashed on the screen, but Victoria let it go to voicemail, then rang again. She imagined him in his comfortable retirement, watching his careful fortune evaporate as digital breadcrumbs led back to his participation in systematic murder. Instead, she placed a different call. Director Morrison. The FBI director's voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to late-night crises. "Sir, this is Deputy Director Hayes. I'm calling to submit my immediate resignation and to inform you that you'll be receiving a formal confession within the hour." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Victoria to hear Morrison's sharp intake of breath. "Victoria, what the hell are you talking about?" "Elena Rivera, the trafficking network. 15 years of active cover-up that reaches into current bureau operations." Victoria's voice held steady, professional to the end. "It's all being exposed tomorrow morning, and the evidence trail leads directly to me. I thought you should have advance warning before justice comes calling. Jesus Christ. How bad is it?" Victoria looked out her hospital window at the Washington skyline, at the city where she'd spent her entire adult life climbing ladders built from other people's graves. Bad enough that the Bureau will spend the next decade rebuilding public trust. Bad enough that congressional oversight will gut our budget and operational independence. Bad enough that everyone will remember this as the moment federal law enforcement lost its moral authority. Morrison's breathing quickened. "Can we contain it? Damage control?" "No, sir. The prosecutor handling this is Elena Rivera's daughter. She has recordings, financial evidence, and as of 5 minutes ago, complete operational files that I just provided. This isn't going away." The confession felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating simultaneously. For 15 years, Victoria had carried the weight of institutional protection, had bent herself into increasingly impossible shapes to maintain a lie that served no one except the people who'd profited from Elena's death. "Why?" Morrison's voice carried genuine bewilderment. "Why are you doing this now?" Victoria closed her eyes, seeing Elena's face with crystalline clarity for the first time in years. Not the victim she'd tried to forget, but the woman who'd trusted her completely. The mother who'd called her hermana and meant it. "Because I finally remembered what I used to believe in," Victoria said quietly, "before I learned that beliefs were luxury items in federal law enforcement." She hung up before Morrison could respond, then powered down the phone completely. Outside her window, Washington continued its eternal dance of power and ambition, but Victoria felt strangely disconnected from it all. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't calculating angles or managing crises or protecting institutional interests. She was just a woman who'd finally chosen truth over survival, even though the choice had come far too late to save the person who'd mattered most. The cardiac monitor beeping beside her bed provided a steady rhythm as Victoria began writing her full confession, finally ready to face the human cost of her choices without the protective barrier of institutional justification. The confession took Victoria 3 hours to complete. Her handwriting, usually precise and controlled, grew increasingly unsteady as she documented each betrayal in clinical detail. The cardiac monitor's rhythm provided a metronome for 15 years of buried truth, each beep marking another sentence that dismantled her carefully constructed justifications. When she finished, dawn was breaking over Washington. Victoria set the papers aside and watched the city wake up, joggers emerging for their morning runs, coffee shops switching on their lights, federal workers beginning another day of maintaining systems that had outlived their moral foundations. She remembered her own routine from just days ago, the comfortable predictability of a life built on institutional power. That woman felt like a stranger now. Dr. Martinez, not the ICE agent who'd triggered this reckoning, but the cardiologist who'd been monitoring her recovery, arrived with her morning rounds. She frowned at Victoria's chart, then at the confession sitting openly on the bedside table. "Your blood pressure is elevated again," she said, checking the monitors. "You should be resting." "I am resting," Victoria replied, "for the first time in 15 years. The doctor's expression suggested she didn't understand, but Victoria didn't elaborate. How could she explain that the crushing weight she'd carried for so long had finally lifted, replaced by something lighter but infinitely more honest? Not peace, she didn't deserve that, but clarity. Her phone, powered back on, showed 17 missed calls from Morrison, 12 from Kellerman, and 3 from her ex-husband Marcus. Word was spreading through the networks that had sustained her career. Soon, those same networks would close ranks to protect themselves, and Victoria would become what Elena had been 15 years ago, an inconvenient truth that needed to be managed. The difference was that Victoria had chosen this exposure. Isabella arrived at 11, dressed in the same professional attire she'd worn to their first confrontation, but carrying something Victoria hadn't expected: the stuffed elephant she'd given to a frightened 10-year-old girl during safe house visits. Esperanza looked worn, but carefully maintained, her gray fabric softened by years of handling. "I brought her with me to every court appearance," Isabella said, noticing Victoria's stare. "Law school graduation, bar exam results, my first prosecution. She reminded me why I was fighting." Victoria's throat tightened. "I'd forgotten about her." "I know." Isabella sat in the visitor's chair, placing the elephant carefully on her lap. "You forgot about a lot of things. It was easier that way." They sat in silence, two women separated by tragedy, but connected by the ghost of someone who'd loved them both. Victoria could see Elena in Isabella's careful composure, in the way she processed emotion without letting it overwhelm her purpose. The daughter had inherited her mother's strength, but channeled it toward justice rather than survival. "The motion was filed an hour ago," Isabella said eventually. "The classified files you sent will take longer to process, but the foundation is laid. Grand jury convenes next month." Victoria nodded. "How many people will this destroy?" 14 federal agents, 6 retired officials, 3 sitting congressmen, and 1 deputy FBI director. Isabella's voice carried no satisfaction, only professional assessment, plus whatever secondary prosecutions emerged from the evidence trail. "And the trafficking network?" "Dismantled. Your operational files contained routing information that led to 3 major hubs. ICE and DEA made coordinated arrests this morning." Isabella paused. 47 people rescued, including 16 children. The number hit Victoria like a physical blow. 47 lives saved by the information she could have provided 15 years ago. Children who would go home to their families instead of disappearing into forced labor, or worse. The mathematics of redemption were impossibly complex. But this felt like a beginning. "She would have been proud of you," Victoria said quietly. "Elena, not of me, but of what you became." Isabella's composure cracked fractionally. "She used to tell me stories about her FBI agent Hermana, who would change everything, who would make the system work for people like us instead of against us." Her voice steadied. She was half right. Victoria understood. Elena's faith in systemic change had been naive, but her faith in human capacity for justice had been realized through her daughter's relentless pursuit of truth. The system hadn't been reformed. It had been forced to confront its own corruption by someone it had tried to silence. "I'll be in federal prison by Christmas," Victoria said. "The others might plea down, but I won't. Elena deserves someone taking full responsibility." Isabella studied her for a long moment. "Is that supposed to be redemption?" "No." Victoria's voice was quiet but certain. "Redemption would require bringing her back, and I can't do that. This is just acknowledgement of what I destroyed and what I can't repair." Isabella stood, carefully tucking Esperanza into her briefcase. At the door, she paused. "She forgave you," Isabella said, "but forgiveness and consequences are different things." After she left, Victoria returned to watching the city through her window. Washington continued its eternal dance, but she was no longer part of its rhythm. For the first time since she'd joined the Bureau, Victoria Hayes was simply a woman who'd finally chosen truth over survival, knowing it was far too late to matter for the person who deserved that choice most. The cardiac monitor continued its steady beeping, marking time in a life that had finally found its authentic rhythm.